Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to my channel. I wanted to talk about a book that I read last year for the first quarter of Historathon 2024, where we read a lot of ancient Greek and Roman history. And it was a book that I got from Princeton University Press that was sent to me, and I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. That's my cat. If you hear one of them, if you hear meowing and chasing up and down the hallway here, my apologies. This is That Tyrant Persuasion: How Rhetoric Shaped the Roman World by J.E. Lendon, put out by Princeton University Press. And I think we can all agree that the way we publicly engage with issues shapes the Overton window, let's say, around them. In ancient Rome, I think by far the most prevalent means of civic engagement was the practice of rhetoric, whether it was public oratory or writing meant to incite meaningful political action. Roman education also offers an entire world in which assumptions and case studies used to sharpen students' rhetorical capabilities. When I say students, I mean Roman students, ancient Roman students, not ours, can be analyzed for the influence they wrought in political and social life. That might be the most interesting part of this video, to be quite honest. In That Tyrant Persuasion, which came out in 2022 from Princeton University Press, J.E. Lendon looks at how rhetorical education in the Roman world guides public actions and public ideas. The first assumption that needs to be taken seriously here is that rhetorical education is not a neutral body of knowledge for intellectual debate that produces just eloquence or just moral sophistication. How we frame issues and the primacy we give them within the educational sphere, the academic domain, both go on to profoundly and deeply influence civic life. Just as in today's world, there were ways in which Roman education does little more than reaffirm the pre-existing status quo, and others in which it seeks to resist it and push back against it. To that end, J.E. Lendon, I think, smartly begins the book by discussing and classifying grammatical and rhetorical forms that were prevalent in education that was given to, inevitably, young boys in the Roman Empire. The second part of the book looks at the defining moment in the late Roman Republic, which is the assassination of Julius Caesar and the events that immediately follow it. Lendon examines the ways in which the assassins planned the murder, why they all wanted to stab Caesar, and the fascinating question of why they chose not to kill Caesar's political allies, especially when they had the opportunity to exact even more damage in doing so to Caesar's dictatorial ambitions. Why did the conspirators so clearly fail to think through their plan after the assassination? And why did they make the decision, which surely would strike most contemporary readers of history today as bizarre, to give public speeches admitting to their crime immediately after committing it? Lendon concludes in his book that many outcomes can be explained by the ways in which rhetoric was taught. Traces that line back to rhetoric. He argues that declamatory rhetorical exercises, which often involved scenarios of discussing multiple assassins killing a dictator and being greeted by a rapturously grateful public, exerted a really big influence that later emperors like Domitian would build their public images by deliberately avoiding these autocratic tropes that were so popular at the time. I thought this was a really strong argument, even though it takes the same form of the arguments that I'm going to criticize here in just a second. And even if it is basically ex post facto evidence. The rest of the book I found a lot weaker, not only because the arguments are fewer and more speculative, but the examples are more abstruse for the average reader. Of course, that's not to say that they're worse examples, but I, as a very obvious non-classicist, am less familiar with them. So they didn't mean as much to me, and I wasn't as prepared to assess them. The third part of the book takes up public buildings in the eastern part of the empire. He argues that the Nymphaeum, the Nymphaeum is a public grotto-like monument to water nymphs that served as sources of water, were encouraged by forms of oratory, notably the panegyric, or panegyric. Similarly, public encomia, speeches of praise, given in praise of cities, encouraged the construction of things like colonnaded streets. No one thinks that philotimia, which is the love of honor, was unimportant to Romans, but the degree to which rhetorical handbooks are responsible for this is debatable. Lendon claims that frequent mentions of Nymphaea in rhetoric were responsible for their own later construction. And this I find a much less compelling connection. The last part of the book was on, if we couldn't get any more abstruse, it is kind of an academic text, so apologize for getting into the weeds about some concepts that aren't exactly popularly known. The last part of the book is on the Roman legal concept of stellionatus, which is basically dishonest or irresponsible behavior that isn't explicitly illegal. Is even more speculative, with its argument proceeding in much the same way. For example, that discussions of law in Roman rhetorical curricula exerted an influence on Roman imperial legal traditions. Lendon admits the influence here is more attenuated and less direct, even making the possibly self-defeating claim that many Roman laws flatly contradicted the legal concepts set out in declamatory rhetoric. The problem with the approach that Lendon uses throughout the book, really, is that he is inevitably forced to rely on a what I think amounts to a logical fallacy. And that is something like this. X directly caused Y because it happened before Y. While it can sometimes appear convincing when a lot of evidence is brought to bear on a case, this amounts nothing more to a series of, well, like I said, logical fallacies. They even have a name in logic. They're given a proper Latin name. They're called post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacies. And even when Lendon harnesses his evidence well, as he does in the discussion of Caesar's assassination, there are still other factors that could have contributed to the observed outcomes that he wants to talk about. Drawing one through line from rhetorical education to these outcomes may place undue emphasis on them at the expense of other explanatory outcomes. For example, is it possible that the emergence of Nymphaea could be partially explained by shifting ideas around the use of public space? Or that Nymphaea might be more effective as a means of imperial propaganda than other buildings, since they are, after all, dedicated to minor gods, water nymphs. As an obvious non-classicist, I want to stress that, again, I'm not a classicist, as is readily apparent. I'm not equipped to assess the weight of all of these factors. but a book like this should have given them, I think, a little more consideration than it did. It's a slim 150 pages. It looks thicker than that because half of it is notes. It is 300 pages, but the actual readable part is just 150. He certainly had the space to write more and consider more if he wanted to. In its current form, the book presents a kind of provocative thesis that can only be supported by mostly weak circumstantial evidence. It's worth noting that a proper review of this book would take a specialist, which I'm not. But since I review everything I read, I wanted to put something here for future reference, just in case anyone else was curious and ran across the book. If anyone else, specialist or not, has read this and wants to weigh in on how convincing you found the arguments, please let me know. I would love to hear differing opinions, especially by people who know more about Stellionatus and Nymphaea than I do. It's my take on that Tyrant Persuasion, How Rhetoric Shaped the Roman World by J.E. Lendon. I will see you soon in another video. Bye.